There's a moment every long-running series reaches where something feels different. Not worse, not broken, just changed. With Stranger Things, that moment is hard to pin down. Some people say it's with season 2, others say season 3 turned into something else entirely, and some argue it didn't really change at all, it just got bigger. But when you go back to season 1, something becomes clear almost immediately. This wasn't just the beginning of a story, it was a complete one. Every character mattered, every storyline had a purpose. The kids, the teenagers, the adults, all moving separately, but towards the same thing. So the question isn't just what went wrong, or what changed, it's when. Because somewhere between a missing kid in Hawkins and a franchise spanning seasons, spin-offs, and cultural dominance, Strange Things stopped being a tightly told story and became something else. People react to these changes in different ways. Many did negatively. There's an old saying, no one hates Star Wars more than Star Wars fans. And honestly, that applies to every fandom. The people who love something the most are the ones who pick it apart the most. When you're emotionally invested in something, you notice every flaw, every inconsistency, and every weird creative choice. And if you've been online lately, you already know that Stranger Things fans have been going through that exact same cycle. This is one of those shows that feels almost impossible to talk about neutrally. It wasn't just popular, it became a cultural moment. When you think about the summer of 2016, you probably think about Pokemon Go and Stranger Things. And I'm as invested in this show as anyone. When the first season came out, my family's kitchen was being renovated, so we were temporarily staying at my aunt and uncle's house. Between my siblings and cousins, there were 6 kids sharing rooms and fighting over the TV. The whole place felt chaotic. There was barely enough space to sit in peace, let alone relax. A friend had asked me if I had seen Stranger Things, and I'd figured I'd wait until I got back home and to watch it. But then another friend messaged me, and then another. At that point, it was clear that if I didn't start watching soon, I was going to get spoiled. And while I've chilled out about spoilers in recent years, it was still something I absolutely hated back then. So when I finally got my turn with the TV, I started the show. I didn't expect my brothers and cousins to chill out and start watching it with me. And if you knew them at the time, you would know how rare that was. We finished the first season in 2 days. From that point on, watching new seasons together became a tradition. It's a hassle now that we're all scattered around and have responsibilities, but we make the effort to watch together because we still enjoy the show so much. I have genuinely fond memories because of this show. And I'm not the only one. When it first released, Stranger Things didn't just get popular, it became inescapable. It hit with the cultural force of Harry Potter or the MCU. The mystery, the music, the kids against the unknown, everything landed at exactly the right time. And while Netflix had popular original shows before, like House of Cards or Orange is the New Black, Stranger Things was the one that made everyone realize that a streaming service could make something that was enjoyed almost universally. That Netflix could have a show that left a mark on the medium as a whole. But that's exactly what invites a difficult question. This show went on for so long, with such high expectations built up around it and attached to it, that it somehow became both too much and not enough. There isn't enough character development. There's too many characters. Not enough resolutions. Too many over-explanations. These aren't questions that will come up with every show. It usually only comes up when something starts strong enough so that the fans don't want to let it go, but also don't want to see what was once so great become diluted. In my eyes, Stranger Things sits right in the middle of all that tension. On one hand, it's easy to argue that the show simply grew over time. Bigger cast, bigger threats, longer episodes, and higher production values. In that sense, it did what many successful series do. It expanded. It became more cinematic and more ambitious. But it also lost all the confidence in its ability to hold the audience's attention. We'll get to that. Which goes to show that growth isn't always improvement. It's an unfortunate truth that all long-running stories have a tendency to stretch themselves thin. Mystery turns into mythology for the audience to memorize, and intimate character moments are exchanged for spectacle. Characters stop feeling like people and start feeling like pieces that need to be moved into position for the next big moment. And Stranger Things has flirted with all of these problems. What makes this especially frustrating is that Stranger Things didn't start as a sprawling saga. Season 1 feels almost aggressively self-contained. It tells a complete story. In just 8 episodes, it introduces its characters, establishes its world, resolves its central mystery, and leaves just enough unanswered questions to feel intriguing rather than frustrating. Which makes me wonder, did Stranger Things need to become what it did? Or did its sudden popularity make it always destined to be a multiple season show? I didn't make this video simply to praise the show or tear it down. I'm not interested in calling it a masterpiece or declaring it completely ruined. What I do instead is look at how Stranger Things has evolved, season by season, and ask whether that evolution strengthened the story or slowly diluted what made it work so well in the first place. We're going to talk about tone shifts, character growth and stagnation, runtime bloat, the ever-expanding mythology and the increasing pressure placed on the writers of the show as it became Netflix's most valuable property. We'll also examine why certain creative decisions made sense in the moment, even if they created long-term problems for the story as a whole. And we'll also talk about why some of the criticisms aimed at the show might miss the point entirely. Ultimately, this is a retrospective about scale, about what happens when a story that thrives on intimacy and character is asked to carry blockbuster level expectations, about whether Stranger Things became too big for its own good, or whether it simply changed in ways that some viewers were never going to accept. By the end of this video, I want to answer a simple question that might not have a simple answer. Was Stranger Things too much, or was it never enough? The first season of Stranger Things is a perfect season of television. When I went back and rewatched it, the thing that jumped out at me wasn't just how good it was, it's how complete it felt. This wasn't a show where the writers threw ideas at the walls, hoping something would stick. It wasn't building toward a giant franchise or trying to set up a 5 seasons worth of lore. Season 1 is tight, it's focused. It knows exactly what story it wants to tell, and it tells it with almost no wasted motion. And in case you didn't know, that's because it was meant to end here. I thought this was common knowledge, but the reactions after season 5 made me realize that a lot of people didn't know this. Stranger Things was originally pitched as an anthology series. Each season would be a brand new story in a brand new setting, kind of like True Detective or Fargo. The Hawkins storyline, the missing kid, the monster, the lab, and the girl with powers, it was all supposed to be a one and done mystery. And when you watch season 1 with that in mind, everything suddenly makes sense. The pacing, the structure, the way every single character has a purpose, and every storyline actually goes somewhere. It wasn't built to stretch on forever. It was built to work for that one particular story. And at its core, season 1 is a mystery. Will Byers disappears, and something is clearly wrong with the town of Hawkins. But instead of dumping exposition on the audience, the show lets the mystery unfold through character action. We learn things because the characters do things, not because someone sits down and explains the plot. And the smartest decision the show makes, maybe the smartest decision in the entire series, is splitting the story into 3 parallel threads: the kids, the teenagers, and the adults. On paper, that could have been a mess. Through the 3 storylines, we got different tones and emotional perspectives, and 3 sets of characters, which sounds like too much for a single show. But in practice, it's what gives this season so much depth. Each group is experiencing the same central mystery, but from a completely different angle. And the show respects each storyline equally. Later seasons will get bigger, louder, and more chaotic. But Season 1 is laser focused. The kids' storyline is the heart of and iconography of the show. Mike, Dustin, and Lucas aren't written like mini adults or exaggerated sitcom stereotypes. They feel like actual kids, awkward, loyal, and petty. They're also brave in the way that kids are brave, which is to say they don't really fully understand the danger they're in, but they care too much about their missing friend to back down. Their search for Will isn't driven by plot mechanics, it's driven by friendship. And that's why it works. And then there's 11. Her introduction is handled with so much restraint. The show doesn't over-explain her powers. It doesn't give her a giant info dump backstory. It treats her like a traumatized child who happens to be dangerous. This isn't a superhero origin story. The fact that she has powers is almost superfluous. And Millie Bobby Brown carries half the emotional weight of the season with barely any dialogue. It's honestly wild how good she is at that age. She sells fear, confusion, and longing for normality, all with just her eyes. The showrunners trusted her, and she delivered. And credit where it's due, the casting director deserves a medal. Finding one good child actor is hard. Finding 4 who have chemistry, timing, and emotional range, that feels like a minor miracle. And the kids feel like real friends, not actors just reading like their lines. Their arguments, jokes, and fear all feel real. That authenticity is a huge part of why season 1 works. The teenage storyline, Nancy, Jonathan, Steve, it adds a completely different flavour to the show. It's not just a side plot, it's equal to the kids' storylines. Nancy's arc is one of the most underrated parts of the season. She starts off trying to fit into a version of herself she doesn't actually like, and Barb's disappearance forces her to confront the consequences of trying to be someone she's not. Jonathan's grief is quieter, but just as important. He's not the brooding outcast stereotype. He's just trying to hold his family together while everything falls apart. And Steve is fascinating in season 1. He starts off as the shallow jerk boyfriend, but he's not a villain. He's insecure and immature, definitely, but he's also capable of growth. And the show lets him grow in small, believable ways. He doesn't hijack the story. He doesn't suddenly become the hero. He just takes the first steps to becoming a better person. Again, every character serves a purpose. No one is wasted. Then we have the adults, who ground the entire show emotionally. Joyce Byers could have easily been written as the crazy mum, but the show never treats her that way. From the very first episode, her certainty that Will is alive is taken seriously by the audience, because we know that she's right immediately. Winona Ryder plays her with this perfect mix of desperation and determination. She's frantic, but she's not irrational. But what surprised me the most about season 1 was Hopper. Normally the small town cop is either useless at best and an obstacle at worst. But Hopper is more than just a gruff cop stereotype. He's a man drowning in grief, slowly being pulled back into caring about something. His investigation into Hawkins' lab is methodical but reckless. He makes mistakes, but every choice he makes pushes the story forward. And that's the theme again. Every character is pulling their weight. No one is there just to fill space. No one exists purely to set up future seasons. If you removed almost any character from season 1, the story would fall apart. That's not something later seasons can claim. Season 1's casting is honestly one of the best ensemble casts in modern TV. The kids are incredible, the teens are believable, and they aren't annoying like in some other shows. And the adults round out the cast with their emotional weight. Nobody feels miscast. The chemistry between the kids is like lightning in a bottle. The adults feel like real people, not archetypes. Even the side characters like Mr. Clark, Benny, Barb, they feel like they belong in this world. They make Hawkins feel like a real place. It's rare for a first season to feel this cohesive, but Stranger Things nailed it. All this careful setup pays off in the final 2 episodes, where the show pulls off something that later seasons struggle with. Every storyline converges naturally. The kids, the teens, and the adults all reach the same truth from different directions. There's no plot convenience. No sudden everyone just happens to show up at the same place at the same time. It feels earned because each group has been moving towards this moment the entire time. And the climax isn't just about fighting the Demogorgon either. It's about closure. Will is found and brought home, Joyce's faith is validated, Hopper confronts his grief, and 11 makes a sacrifice that feels final. the story resolves both emotionally and narratively. That's what I like so much about it. Season 1 just ends. It doesn't drag its feet. Even the final hints, like Will puking up the slugs down the drain and Hopper leaving the Eggos out in the forest, they feel like cool little mysterious hints that not everything's quite yet resolved. Is Will really safe from the Upside Down? Is Elle really alive? Knowing now that the show was always meant to be an anthology only reinforces how intentional this season feels. It wasn't designed to sprawl or escalate onwards forever. It was designed to tell one story, and they did it really well. As Stranger Things continued, it got bigger, with more characters and an expanding mythology. Later seasons had longer episodes and higher stakes, and while some of that worked, something essential got lost along the way. Season 1 had discipline through its limitations, because it forced creativity. Later seasons didn't have that. Its roster of characters multiplied, and subplots expanded. Not everyone was pulling their weight anymore. Some characters existed purely to set up future seasons, or just to fill up space. Season 1 avoids all of that. Because it understands something simple. Focus is power. Every character exists for a reason. Every storyline matters. And every emotional beat is earned. When it's over, you don't feel exhausted. You feel satisfied. That's not just good television. That's a story that knew exactly what it was and exactly when to stop. Stranger Things 2 is a natural sequel to the first. When Stranger Things 2 was announced, I don't think I've ever been more excited for anything related to this show. The Comic-Con trailer, the one with the Ghostbuster suits, the giant shadow monster, and the perfect mix of nostalgia and dread, had me fully convinced that Season 2 was about to be something great. I literally showed up late to class because I lost track of time rewatching it. It interested me because it felt like the show was leveling up. Bigger scale, bigger stakes, bigger everything. And honestly, going into it, I was ready for all of it. And after watching it, I was still a fan. I still enjoyed it. I thought it was good, and definitely better than the seasons 3 and 5. But even back then, something felt different. The story felt looser and less focused. Less tight than season 1. And looking back now, that makes a lot of sense. Season 1 was originally designed to be a complete story. A beginning, a middle, and an end. Season 2, on the other hand, was the beginning of Stranger Things trying to figure out what it meant to continue. There was only a year and a half between seasons, which might sound like a lot, but this had to be written from scratch. And that shift, from a self-contained mystery to an ongoing series, is exactly where the cracks start to show. Season 2 is still good, but it's also the first time the show starts to lose the discipline that made Season 1 so strong. And honestly, looking at TV now, it almost feels nostalgic. There have been messed up production schedules so badly that half the shows I watch come back so late that I need a recap just to remember who the characters are. Compared to that chaos, Stranger Things 2 was practically punctual. One of the biggest differences between Season 1 and Season 2 is how the characters are used. In Season 1, every single character served a purpose. If you removed anyone, Mike, Hopper, Joyce, Nancy, Jonathan, Steve, or even side characters like Mr. Clark, the story would break. Everyone was pulling their weight. Season 2 doesn't have that same clarity. Take Mike for example. In Season 1, he was the emotional center of the kid's storyline. His bond with Eleven was the heart of the show. His determination to find Will drove the plot forward. He had agency and purpose. In Season 2, Mike spends most of the season sidelined. He's grieving Eleven, he's angry, frustrated, and all of that is understandable for his character, yeah, but the story doesn't give him anything meaningful to do. He reacts to the plot but doesn't influence it. He realizes Will is a spy, but can't do anything to stop Hawkins' lab from being attacked. He's present, but no longer essential. And that's a huge shift from season 1, where he was arguably the main character of the kids' storyline. And speaking of 11, her separation from the rest of the cast is one of the biggest structural problems of season 2. One of the highlights of season 1 was 11's dynamic with the boys. Their friendship, arguments, and loyalty was the emotional engine of the show. 11 wasn't just a plot device, she was part of the group. She belonged with them, and season 2 takes that away. Most of the season, 11 is isolated. She's either with Hopper or she's alone on her own side quest. And while her relationship with Hopper is generally great, their father-daughter dynamic is one of the best things that the show has ever done. It does come at the cost of her connection with the rest of the cast. Her absence is felt in every scene the boys have without her. The chemistry that made season 1 so special just isn't there. And when she finally reunites with them in the finale, it's emotional, but it also highlights how much we missed out on. And it's not just the kids she's separated from. In season 1, there's a brief but powerful moment where Joyce connects with 11. It's small, but it's meaningful. Joyce sees a scared child who's been experimented on and abused. 11 sees a maternal figure she desperately needs, especially after what the audience learns about her mother, Terry Ives. Season 2 completely drops that possible thread. Joyce and 11 barely interact. The show doesn't explore their connection, their potential bond, or the emotional fallout of 11 learning about her mother. It's a missed opportunity, and it's one of the clearest signs that season 2 didn't have the same intentionality as season 1. One thing I did appreciate in season 2 was Nancy's storyline. After season 1, fans were furious about Barb's death, not just because she died, but because the show seemed to move on from it so quickly. Season 2 addresses that head on. Nancy dealing with the guilt, the grief, and the anger over what happened to Barb feels real. It feels earned because it shows consequences, and it gives Nancy a clear purpose in the story. Her decision to expose Hawkins' labs isn't just a plot point, it's a character-driven choice rooted in everything she went through in season 1. It's one of the few examples in season 2 where the show expands the story without losing emotional focus. But Jonathan doesn't get that same clarity. In season 1, he was a crucial part of the emotional core. The older brother desperately trying to find Will. He was a kid who spent his whole life feeling like an outsider, suddenly thrust into a nightmare that forced him to step up. One of the best and hardest to watch scenes in season 1 was where Jonathan had an argument with Joyce in the middle of town. He didn't want to leave Will alone in that freezer. He had to organise the funeral on his own. He was only 16 at the most. As someone with 3 younger brothers, that hit me quite hard. But in season 2, he's pushed to the sidelines. Instead of being involved in Will's storyline, which should have been the natural place for him, especially with everything his brother was going through, Jonathan is mostly treated as Nancy's sidekick. He tags along on her mission, supports her choices, and reacts to her arc, but he doesn't really have one of his own. It's not that their partnership is bad, it's that it comes at the cost of Jonathan's connection to his own family. While Joyce, Hopper, and Mike are fighting to save Will, and Will is going through the most traumatic experiences of his life, Jonathan feels strangely absent from the emotional center of the story. For a character who was so essential in season 1, season 2 doesn't seem to know what to do with him. Season 2 also introduces Max and Billy, 2 characters who have become incredibly important in later seasons. Max especially becomes one of the emotional anchors of the entire series, and Billy's arc in season 3 is one of the most compelling parts of that season. But in season 2, they don't really serve a purpose. Max is introduced as a new girl, the outsider, the one who disrupts the boys' dynamic. And because 11 is isolated for most of the season, the tension between them is only hinted at but never fully develops. And because Mike is sidelined, the friction between Max and Mike doesn't fully develop either. Max is present, but she's not integrated properly. Billy, meanwhile, is introduced as this chaotic, aggressive force, but he doesn't connect to the main plot. He's a threat, definitely, but not a meaningful one. He's a character with potential, but not direction. Clearly the show wanted to set them up for future seasons, and that's fine. But in season 1, no character existed purely for setup. Everyone mattered right now in the story they were telling. Season 2 doesn't have that same discipline. Season 2 still has a lot going for it though. The Mind Flayer is a great escalation of the Upside Down's mythology. Will's possession storyline is genuinely unsettling. After being sidelined for most of season 1, Noah Schnapp steals the show in season 2. Hopper and Eleven's relationship is one of the most emotional highlights of the entire series because they need each other. Eleven needs a guardian who can protect her from Hawkins' lab, and Hopper needs someone who to help him recover from the grief of losing his daughter, Sarah. Steve and Dustin's friendship, a fan favourite dynamic, begins here and is one of the best relationships in the entire show. It's both fun and interesting, and I find myself wishing they would come back on screen every time it will switch to a different storyline. Season 2 also feels stretched. Scenes linger longer than they need to, subplots drift, characters wander in and out of relevance, and the pacing isn't as sharp as Season 1. Season 1 was 8 episodes of pure momentum. Season 2 is 9 episodes that sometimes feel like they're trying to fill up space. And then there's the episode 7, the infamous Lost Sister episode. And it's not a bad idea, it's not a terrible episode on its own, but it still completely halts the momentum of the season. It isolates Eleven even further, and it feels like a setup for a spin-off that never happened. Season 1 never would have done that. Even with all of these issues, Season 2 is still good. It still has heart and atmosphere. It has characters you care about, and it still feels like the Stranger Things that we knew, just a slightly messier version of it. Despite the flaws, I still remember finishing Season 2 and being excited about the show. I was happy to hear there'll be 3 more seasons on the way. I was still invested, still wanting more. It didn't hit the highs of Season 1, but it didn't lose me either. Season 2 was when Stranger Things shifted from a perfectly contained story to an ongoing series. And with that shift came growing pains. Characters without purpose, storylines that didn't fully connect, and a structure that wasn't as tight as what came before. But it also showed that the world of Stranger Things still had room to grow. It introduced new characters who would become essential and expanded the mythology. It deepened relationships and created new ones. And it proved that the show could survive beyond its original ending. Season 2 isn't perfect, but it's still good. In the grand scheme of Stranger Things, it still stands as the last season that feels close to the spirit of the first, even if it couldn't quite recapture the magic. Stranger Things 3 is a summer blockbuster. If Season 1 felt like a small town mystery, and Season 2 felt like a darker, moodier continuation, then Stranger Things 3 is completely different. This is the moment Stranger Things transforms into a full-on event movie. I remember how many big movies came out in 2019. Avengers Endgame, Rise of Skywalker, Spider-Man Far From Home, and Godzilla King of the Monsters. Stranger Things 3 fit right in. Even its trailer felt like a summer blockbuster, and the actual season followed through in that promise. Bright colours, big action, loud set pieces, neon lights, explosions, and a tone that felt closer to an 80s popcorn flick than the grounded, intimate storytelling that the show started with. And depending on who you ask, that shift was either a breath of fresh air or the beginning of the show losing its identity. I go back and forth on Season 3. At times, it's fun, energetic and stylish, but it's also the season where you can really feel the show stretching itself to try and fit into a new shape. A shape that doesn't always suit every character or storyline. And when you compare it to the tight, focused structure of Season 1, or even the uneven or emotionally grounded Season 2, the contrast is impossible to ignore. The first thing you notice about Season 3 is the look. Gone are the muted colours, the dimly lit basements, and the foggy forests, and the sense of small town claustrophobia. Instead we get the Starcourt Mall, a bright, colourful, perfectly nostalgic monument to 1980s consumerism. It's fun, it's flashy, and it's instantly iconic. But it also signals a shift in tone. Season 1 felt like a Stephen King novel. Season 2 felt like its natural sequel. Season 3 feels like a summer movie you'd watch. And that's not inherently bad. The show is allowed to evolve, but the shift in tone affects the characters in ways that aren't always for the better. Season 3 splits the cast into multiple groups again, but unlike Season 1, where every storyline felt essential, or Season 2, where some storylines were messy but still emotionally grounded, Season 3's structure feels more uneven. Some characters thrive in this new blockbuster tone, others get completely sidelined. Let's start with the group that benefits the most. Dustin, Steve, Robin, and Erica. This is easily the strongest storyline of the season. The chemistry between Steve and Dustin, which started in Season 2, becomes one of the best dynamics of the entire show. Adding Robin to the mix is a perfect choice. She's sharp, funny, grounded, in this season at least, and instantly feels like she belongs. Erica, who was more of a comedic side character before, becomes a scene stealer. Their storyline, uncovering a secret Russian base beneath the mall, is absolutely ridiculous, but it works because the characters make it work. They're fun to watch. They bounce off each other perfectly. And the show gives them enough screen time to let their dynamic breathe. But while this group thrives, other characters don't get the same treatment. Mike and Lucas, for example, feel strangely sidelined. Their storyline revolves around mostly relationship drama. Mike and Eleven breaking up, and Lucas giving hilariously questionable advice. It's not bad, but it's thin. Compared to the emotional weight they carried in Season 1, both individually and their dynamic together, or even their involvement in Season 2, they feel like background characters. They're present, but they're not driving anything. Will, meanwhile, has the most emotionally interesting setups of the entire season. He's the only one who still feels connected to the Upside Down, the only one who senses the Mind Flayer's return, but the show doesn't fully explore it. His storyline is reduced to a few moments of sensing danger and feeling left behind by his friends. It's touching, but it's not nearly enough. Will is one of the most important characters in the entire series, especially in Season 1 and 2, but Season 3 doesn't give him the space he deserves. Then there's Jonathan and Nancy. Their storyline investigating the strange behaviour at the hospital and around town feels like it's trying to recapture the investigative energy of Season 1, but it doesn't land the same way. Jonathan, in particular, feels like he's drifting. In Season 1 he was essential. In Season 2 he was underused but still emotionally relevant. But in Season 3 he's mostly just reacting to Nancy's arc. He's mostly supportive and present, but he's not driving anything. Nancy's storyline has more purpose. She's confronting sexism at the newspaper and pushing to uncover the truth. But even then it still feels disconnected from the rest of the show, at least until she joins Eleven's group later on. Joyce and Hopper, on the other hand, they still fit perfectly into the blockbuster tone. Their dynamic becomes more comedic, more chaotic, more exaggerated. Hopper becomes louder, angrier, more cartoonish, which some fans loved and others didn't. I certainly didn't. I missed the guy from the first 2 seasons. Joyce becomes the determined investigator again, but without either of her kids being in direct danger, it takes on a lighter tone. Their storyline with Murray and Alexei is fun, but it also marks a shift away from the grounded emotional core they had in earlier seasons. Hopper's grief, Joyce's desperation, those elements are still there, but they're buried under layers of comedy and action. And then there's Eleven. Season 3 gives her more agency than Season 2, which is great. She's with the party and directly involved in the action and the plot. She even has some of the most memorable scenes of the season. But the show also leans heavily into her powers as a solution to every problem. Whenever the plot hits a wall, Eleven raises her hand and screams, pushing the plot forward. It's exciting, yeah, but it also means her character development sometimes takes a backseat to spectacle. Her friendship with Max is a highlight of the season though. It's refreshing, and it gives Eleven a chance to be a normal teenager for once. But her emotional arc feels lighter than previous seasons. Without Hawkins' lab, she isn't directly connected to the threat this season, which makes the final confrontation with Billy feel more than a little weak. Billy in Season 3 is undeniably compelling, not just because he looks cool leaning on a Camaro, but because the show gives him these sharp, memorable moments that make him feel impossible to ignore. His scene at the pool, where he flips between charming the mums and barely containing his simmering rage, tells you everything about how he performs confidence while cracking underneath. His possession by the Mind Flayer is another example. The actor plays the internal struggle with the eerie mix of vulnerability and menace, especially in the sauna test where Billy breaks down and begs for help, but then snaps back into something inhuman. And his final stand at Starcourt Mall, confronting the Mind Flayer and protecting Eleven, is genuinely powerful because it's the first time we see him choose something other than anger or fear. But even with all of that, the fandom tends to overcorrect. Billy becomes tragic and misunderstood in a way that conveniently forgets that he was also racist, violent, and genuinely terrifying to the people around him. His sacrifice is meaningful, but it doesn't magically erase all the harm he caused. Season 3 makes him fascinating, but the fandom turns him into a martyr. The Mind Flayer storyline is where the Blockbuster influence is at its most obvious. The creature is bigger and more monstrous than the Demogorgon. The stakes are higher, and the action scenes are more intense. The body horror elements are dialed up. It's entertaining, but it's also a departure from the eerie, atmospheric horror of Season 1. The upside down and the experiments used to feel mysterious and terrifying. In Season 3, it feels like an 80s action movie. And that's really the core of Season 3. It's entertaining, but it's not as tight. The tone is fun, but it's not as focused. The characters are still lovable, but not all of them are used well. The show is bigger, but not always better. Season 3 succeeds when it leans into character chemistry. Steve, Robin, Dustin and Erica, Hopper and Joyce. It struggles when it tries to juggle too many tones at once, like comedy, horror, romance, action and mystery, but without the tight structure that made Season 1 so effective. But even with its flaws, Season 3 is still enjoyable. It's colourful, it's energetic and memorable. The Starcourt Mall setting is really iconic. The battle against the Mind Flayer is emotional and explosive. For the most part, the characters still feel like the same people they were in previous seasons. And while it doesn't recapture the magic of Season 1, it doesn't lose the heart of the show either. Stranger Things 3 is embracing its Blockbuster identity. It's louder, brighter and more chaotic. And while that shift leaves some characters sidelined and some storylines underdeveloped, it also gives the show some of its most entertaining moments. It's no longer the tight, intimate mystery the show started as, but it's still Stranger Things, just a version of it that's traded the quiet horror of the woods for the neon glow of the mall. Stranger Things 4 is the show at its most ambitious. It's somehow even bigger than the previous season, but it's also darker, scarier, and more emotionally intense than anything that came before it. And at the same time, it's also the season where the cracks in the show's structure become impossible to ignore. For every moment of brilliance, there's also a moment where the story feels stretched thin. For every character who shines, there's also another who gets pushed to the sidelines. Season 4 is Stranger Things at its highest, but also most frustrating lows. And the best way to understand that is by looking at the three major storylines: the Hawkins storyline, the California storyline, and the Russia storyline. Let's start with the Hawkins storyline, because this is where the season is at its best. If Season 1 was a mystery and Season 2 was a darker continuation, Season 4 is just full-on horror. The show leans into its influences: Nightmare on Elm Street, Hellraiser, classic supernatural thrillers, and it works beautifully. Vecna is the best villain the show has ever had. I know that isn't a high bar, but putting a human face on the eldritch, otherworldly horror makes it both terrifying and personal. He brings a level of psychological horror that Stranger Things has never really fully explored before. The deaths are brutal. The tension is constant and the atmosphere is thick with dread. Unlike the fun of season 3, Hawkins feels dangerous again. And the characters in Hawkins are used incredibly well. Max's storyline is the emotional core of the season. The guilt, grief, and isolation. It all feels painfully real. Sadie Sink gives one of the strongest performances in the entire season. Lucas gets more depth than he's ever had since season 1. Dustin continues to be the emotional glue of the group. And Eddie Munson, despite being a new character, fits perfectly into the dynamic and becomes instantly iconic. Even the supporting characters, like Jason, Chrissy, the basketball team, they feel purposeful. The Hawkins storyline is tight, focused, and thematically rich. It's everything Stranger Things does best. But then you leave Hawkins, and things get messy. The California storyline is where the story starts to wobble. On paper, it makes sense. The Byers family has moved, Eleven is trying to live a normal life, and the group is split apart geographically for the first time. But in execution, it feels scattered. Mike, Will, and Jonathan, 3 characters who were essential in earlier seasons, spend most of the season just reacting to stuff instead of doing stuff. Will, who was the emotional center of the first 2 seasons, is pushed to the background. His internal struggles are hinted at but never fully explored. Mike, who used to be the heart of the kids' storyline, feels disconnected from the plot entirely. And Jonathan, I don't even know why he's still in the show by this point. He's not even sidelined anymore. It's worse than that. He gets a few comedic moments with Argyle, and that's basically it. California's storyline also introduces new characters. Argyle, Angela, the agents, but none of them feel essential. They're entertaining, especially the Angela scene. But that doesn't add much to the story as a whole. And that's a recurring issue in season 4. More characters keep getting added, but not all of them have a purpose. The cast is already huge, and instead of giving them new things to do, they introduce new characters for those purposes and leave the characters we already knew just to meander around. They're split across multiple locations, which makes it even harder to give everyone the attention they deserve. And Eleven's storyline, which, while interesting, is also pretty frustrating. 11 losing her powers is an interesting idea. It forces her to confront who she is without her abilities. It opens the door for character growth. But the way the show handles her journey is messy. Instead of working with Dr. Owens, who has always been portrayed as a compassionate, morally convicted figure, 11 is dragged back into the world of Dr. Brenner. And Brenner's return is one of the weakest creative decisions the show has ever made. His death in season 1 is clear and final. He was a villain who was killed by a threat he brought into the world. Bringing him back doesn't add depth, it undermines the conclusion we already had for him, as well as the ongoing stakes. It turns a meaningful ending into a fake out. And the idea that 11 would willingly go back to him after everything he did to her feels wrong. It feels like the show is forcing a plotline instead of letting the character make a believable choice. 11 should have regained her powers through her connection with Owens, through her own growth, or through the relationship she's built. Instead, she's pushed back into the arms of a man who traumatized her. It's a decision that weakens her arc instead of strengthening it. And then we get to the Russia storyline, the most divisive part of the season. Hopper's death at the end of season 3 was emotional and powerful. It felt like a real sacrifice. But season 4 immediately undercuts the moment by revealing he survived. Fake out deaths are one of the quickest ways to drain tension from a story, and Stranger Things leans into it hard here. Hopper's survival isn't just unlikely, it's borderline impossible. And once he's in Russia, the storyline just drags. It's slow and repetitive, and it feels disconnected from the rest of the show. Joyce and Murray traveling to Russia has some fun moments, but it also feels like a completely different show. The tone is lighter and more comedic, almost cartoonish at times, which clashes with the horror unfolding in Hawkins. Hopper's scenes in the prison are also emotional, and David Harbour gives a great performance, but the storyline itself feels unnecessary. It doesn't add much to the main plot. It doesn't deepen the mythology. It doesn't even meaningfully develop Hopper's character beyond what we already know. It's a side quest that ends up taking up a huge amount of screen time, without delivering the same narrative weight as the Hawkins storyline. The biggest issue in Season 4 is the imbalance. The Hawkins storyline is so strong, so compelling, and so terrifying that everything else feels weaker by comparison. The California storyline has potential, but lacks focus. The Russia storyline has emotional moments, but feels bloated. And the constant introduction of new characters, some great and some forgettable, stretches the cast even thinner. But despite all of that, Season 4 still delivers some of the best moments in the entire series. The horror elements are phenomenal. Vecna is generally a terrifying villain. The Dear Billy sequence is one of the most powerful scenes in Stranger Things has ever done. The finale is massive, emotional, and visually stunning. The stakes feel real again. Hawkins feels alive again. The show feels dangerous. Season 4 is a season of extremes. When it's good, it's incredible. When it's messy, it's really bad. It's a season that shows the full potential of Stranger Things and the limitation of its expanding scope. The Hawkins storyline proves the show can still deliver tight, character-driven horror. The California and Russia storylines show what happens when the cast becomes too large and the plot becomes too scattered. Stranger Things 4 is ambitious, bold, and unforgettable, but it's also a reminder of what made Season 1 so special. Focus, intimacy, and characters who all had purpose. And as the show moves towards its final season, the question becomes whether it can bring all of that back, or whether the story has grown too big to control. Also, it's hilarious how they never mention Argyle again. When Stranger Things 4 ended, it felt like the show was gearing up for something massive. Hawkins was literally cracking open. The Upside Down was spilling into the real world. The sky was red, smoke was everywhere, and characters were staring at a future that looked apocalyptic. It was the biggest, boldest cliffhanger the show had ever done. For the first time, it felt like the story was about to fundamentally change. The Upside Down wasn't just a threat lurking in the shadows anymore. It was here. It was happening. And Season 5 was supposed to be the payoff. But when Stranger Things 5 finally arrived, that promise didn't fully materialize. Instead of the Upside Down swallowing Hawkins, and the town becoming a full-scale war zone, or the characters navigating a world that had literally merged with the nightmare dimension, the show pulled back. The cracks in the ground were still there, but they were covered up. The invasion never happened in the way the Season 4 finale suggested. Hawkins wasn't transformed. Characters weren't about to recreate Red Dawn or something. The apocalyptic tone was softened, and that shift from what was promised to what we actually got sets the tone for the first 2 volumes of Season 5. Volume 1 and Volume 2 aren't unwatchable. It's still Stranger Things. The first 7 episodes are still entertaining and full of character moments, but they don't feel like the escalation Season 4 set up. They feel like a continuation of what we already had. It's not a transformation. And that's the core issue. The show built up expectations that it didn't fully commit to. One of the clearest examples of this is Vecna. At the end of Season 4, he felt unstoppable. He had won. He had opened the gates and reshaped Hawkins. Season 5 should have been his season, the moment he stepped out of the shadows and became a constant, looming presence. But in Volume 1, he barely appears. He's talked about, but he's not actually there. For a villain who's positioned as the final boss, his absence is noticeable. It makes the threat feel distant, and the season overall feels like it's stalling instead of building. Vecna's lack of presence also affects the characters. In Season 4, everyone had a personal stake in the fight. Max, Lucas, Dustin, Nancy, Steve, they all had direct confrontations with Vecna or the results of his actions. Their fear felt real because the threat was immediate. In Season 5, that immediacy fades. The characters are preparing, investigating, theorizing, and planning and pulling off heists, but they're not actively fighting him. And without Vecna driving the plot forward, the season loses some of the urgency that made Season 4 so gripping. The structure of Season 5 also contributes to this feeling. The cast is at its biggest, and the show has stopped even pretending to give everyone something important to do. Some characters feel underutilized, and others are repeating arcs they've already had. And some feel like they're only present because the show doesn't know how to write them out. Will's storyline has the most emotional weight. His connection to Vecna, his internal conflict, his sense of responsibility. But the show doesn't explore it as deeply as it could. Mike, who was once the emotional center of the kid's storyline, feels disconnected once again. His sister is kidnapped and his parents are in the hospital, and he barely seems to care. Jonathan, who has been drifting since Season 2, continues to orbit Nancy and do nothing else. By the way, did he even talk to Will and Joyce outside of the coming out scene? The show tries to give them emotional moments, but they don't always land because the characters aren't tied closely enough to anything, not even the main plot. And then there's 11. Her arc in Season 5 is complicated, and not in a good way. After everything she went through in Season 4 to get her powers back, and her confrontation with Vecna, Season 5 should have been her moment to step into her power fully. But instead, the show spends a lot of time revisiting old ground. 11 is still struggling with her identity, still questioning her abilities, still dealing with the fallout of her past. These are important themes, but they're themes the show has explored before. And without a strong antagonist presence to push her forward, her storyline feels slower than it should. The show also continues to introduce new characters, something that has been reoccurring since Season 2. But this time it feels like it will be the most necessary, as the military is a real-world threat that's needed to provide an obstacle that prevents the main characters from immediately tracking down Vecna and ending the entire story. But Dr. K fills a role the show has covered multiple times, with far more established figures. By the time she appears, the story already has Owen's and Brenna's legacy to deal with, and an entire set of labs and doctors. She and her army end up feeling like late-game additions, to take up screen time without deepening the stakes in the final season. With a cast this large, every new character takes time away from someone who's already established. And in a final season, that time matters. The audience want closure for the characters they've been following since the beginning, not new faces who won't have enough time to develop. Pacing of Season 5, Volume 1 and 2 reflects this imbalance. There are moments of brilliance, emotional scenes, tense sequences, character interactions that remind you why you fell in love with the show in the first place. But there are also long stretches where the story feels like it's waiting for something to happen. The cliffhanger of Season 4 created the expectation of constant danger, constant movement, constant escalation. Season 5 doesn't deliver that. It's slower, more methodical, more focused on setup than payoff. And that's the biggest issue. Season 5 Volume 1 and 2 feel like setup alone. They feel like the show is holding back, saving everything for the finale. When you build a cliffhanger as massive as the one in Season 4, the audience expects the next season to hit the ground running. Instead, Season 5 eases into that story and circles around the threat instead of confronting it head on. And while that can work in earlier seasons, it doesn't work as well when you're this close to the end. But despite all of these issues, Season 5 still has heart. The characters still care about each other. The emotional moments still land. The moment between Steve and Dustin was a highlight of the season, even if the setup wasn't the best. But it's just not as explosive as the Season 4 finale suggested it will be. Can't stop thinking about the Stranger Things finale. And not in a Deathly Hallows or Avengers Endgame kind of way, where the emotional weight lingers because the story earned it. No, this is more of a Rise of Skywalker kind of situation. The kind of ending that leaves you a little hollow. I wasn't impressed. Just been wondering how a show this big and carefully built somehow stumbled at the finish line. At the center of that stumble is Eleven's death. Because the finale clearly wants her sacrifice to land with the same emotional force as Tony Stark's in Endgame. But the comparison only highlights how different the two moments really are. Tony Stark dies redeemed, completing a journey that's been building for over a decade. He goes out surrounded by the people he loves, who understand why he did what he did. Eleven, on the other hand, dies alone. She dies separated from the people she spent 5 seasons fighting for, in the same emotional place she started, isolated, misunderstood, and burdened with a responsibility no one else can share. Tony Stark's death is the end of his arc. Eleven's death is the repetition of one. And that's the problem. The show treats her sacrifice like a full circle moment, but instead of closing her story, it resets it. Now, to be fair, the finale almost backs itself into a corner. There's this sense that someone had to die. But when you look at the cast, the options shrink fast. Mike is too insignificant to carry the emotional weight of the finale death. Ironically, when Volume 1 started, Mike actually became a little more significant again, even though enough that I generally thought that they might kill him off. But by the end, he's back to being narratively sidelined. Hopper was still possible, but risky. He already had 2 fake-out deaths, so a third would have been laughable. And 11, well, she's the main character, or the mascot. Maybe that's too rude. The face? Yeah, 11 is the face of the show. But I find killing her is the darkest possibility. Not because it's tragic, but because of what it means. And here's where the Duffers' own philosophy becomes a problem. They've said multiple times that 11 represents the magic of childhood, and that her death symbolizes the end of innocence. But Stranger Things isn't the Goonies. There's no childhood whimsy here. Right from season 1, there's trauma, violence, and loss. 11 doesn't represent childhood magic. She represents the destruction of it. She's a girl who never got to have a childhood at all. So killing her to symbolize the end of childhood misunderstands the character they wrote. It's a metaphor that doesn't fit into the world they built. And if you accept the idea of her dying, the show introduces the concept far too late. If this was always the plan, the entire season should have been building towards it. Instead, the idea of her sacrificing herself pops up in the final stretch, almost like a last-minute rewrite. And the worst part, the show misses the opportunity it had to flip the usual dynamic. But once, just once, the team should have fought for her. 11 has spent 5 seasons saving everyone else. The finale should have been the moment where the party finally came together to save her. Instead, she dies alone, again, while the others watch from a distance, again, and Mike clings to hope, again. Which brings us to the biggest structural flaw. Season 5 ends exactly the same as Season 1. 11 sacrifices herself. Mike refuses to believe she's gone. Her fate is left ambiguous, because in Season 1 it was the Eggos in the forest, and in Season 5 it's Mike's theory about how she vanished from the truck and reached the portal in the first place. What felt mysterious and exciting in Season 1 feels repetitive and empty in Season 5. The show has 5 seasons to evolve beyond this dynamic, and instead it just loops back to it. It's not poetic or symbolic. It's not a full circle. It feels like stagnation. And while we're talking about stagnation, let's talk about the Mind Flayer. Because the moment it appears in its final form, it looks less like a cosmic horror entity and more like a Godzilla monster. And that raises a question the show never wants you to ask. Could the military have handled this? The finale never explores the factions within the government that could have supported the main cast. Dr. Owens was someone who helped them in the past, yet he's completely absent from the final season. Imagine how different the finale would feel if Owens returned and the sympathetic military faction joined the fight. If the government wasn't a monolithic villain, but a fractured system that has both allies and enemies for its main characters. Then there's Dr. K. And just to be clear, this is entirely my theory. The show never explains her motives, which is exactly why the ending feels so strange. But my theory is that the only way the finale makes sense is if Dr. K doesn't actually believe 11 is gone, and is deliberately leaving the main characters out in the open to draw her out. Because otherwise, the fact that none of the main characters get arrested after everything they did is really bizarre. They're standing in the middle of a national disaster zone with a 5-season history of being connected to government incidents, and somehow they walk away without consequence. The lack of fallout only tracks if Dr. K is quietly manipulating the situation behind the scenes, using them as bait while keeping the rest of the government off their backs. And if that isn't what the show intended, then it's just another example of how the final season drops the plot threads it just doesn't want to deal with anymore. And then there's Vecna. This might sound wild, but Vecna stopped being a threat after season 4. Once 11 beat him at the end of season 4, the show struggled to make him feel dangerous again. The finale tries to re-establish him as the ultimate villain, but the tension is gone. And that's why the idea of Will turning Vecna to their side, like Darth Vader in Return of the Jedi, is generally better storytelling. Imagine this, instead of Will trying to reach Vecna emotionally in the finale, he successfully does it early in the season. Vecna turns against the Mind Flayer, 11 and Vecna team up, the others fight the Demogorgon army, and a sympathetic military faction joins the battle. The final fight becomes a multi-front war instead of a single beam struggle, and the kids fighting Muto from Godzilla. It would have been bold and surprising, and triumphant for all these different factions to come together, but instead the finale teases the idea for a moment and then drops it. And the team that has always worked together to overcome threats just overcomes another. And that's the unintended theme of the entire finale. Ideas are introduced too late and then resolved too quickly. The characters face no long-term consequences for their actions and decisions. The Mind Flayer becomes a kaiju, Vecna becomes a background character, and 11 dies in a way that feels less like a conclusion and more like a reset. And that's why the finale has lingered with me. Not because it's good, but because it's frustrating. It isn't tragic, it just feels empty. Because when you look at everything the show has set up, 11 confronting her past, Will's connection to Vecna, the party fighting together, you can see the bones of what made the show great, what could have been a great ending. But the finale doesn't build on those bones. It rushes through them or ignores them completely. Even off the top of your head, you can imagine better versions of this story. Imagine what they should have done with a team of writers and a budget. Because Stranger Things deserved an ending that felt like a combination of everything it's built, not the repetition of where it started. Stranger Things didn't fail because it became bad overnight. It failed because it became too successful to stay focused. At its core, this show was never designed to carry the weight it eventually had to hold. Season 1 worked because it was small, intimate, and disciplined. It trusted its characters and trusted the audience to follow the mystery without being spoon-fed. It didn't try to be everything at once. It picked a lane and committed to it, and executed it flawlessly. But once Stranger Things became Netflix's crown jewel, it stopped being allowed to end. Every season had to get bigger. Every threat had to escalate. Every character had to stick around, even when the story no longer had a place for them. And in chasing scale, the show slowly lost confidence and restraint that made it special in the first place. That doesn't mean the later seasons were empty. Season 2 and 3 delivered some of the show's most iconic character dynamics. Season 4 proved it could still produce generally great horror and emotional storytelling. Even Season 5 has flashes of what once made the series resonate. Stranger Things never became unwatchable, it just became unfocused. And that's the real tragedy. Not that it evolved, but that it kept circling the same ideas without ever resolving them. Characters repeated arcs instead of completing them. Stakes were raised, then reversed. Sacrifices were made, then undone, or repeated so often that they lost their meaning. The show wanted its ending to feel poetic, but it ended up feeling cyclical, not full circle, just stuck. When people argue about whether or not Stranger Things fell off, they're really arguing about what they wanted it to be. Some wanted escalation in either threat or spectacle, or both. Others wanted closure. The show tried to deliver all of these things at once, and in doing so, delivered none of them completely. So did Stranger Things try to do too much, or did it fail to do enough? The truth is both. It became too much in scale. Its cast became too bloated, and the story became too hesitant to let go of what once worked. But it was never enough in that areas that mattered the most: consequences, resolution, and trust in its own characters. It kept expanding outward instead of digging deeper. And yet, despite all of that, Stranger Things still had an impact. For me, it created shared memories. For most people, it defined a decade in pop culture. It introduced characters people genuinely loved, and that counts for something. Not every story gets to be perfect, and sometimes the ones that almost are the most frustrating. Stranger Things didn't need to be a 5-season epic, but for a while, it reminded us what great television could feel like. And maybe that's enough.